There's a small area of woods next to my grandmother's house on the edge of our town. It's not very big, only 10 square miles, so you wouldn't think it possible to become lost in them, and you would be right. Except for 1 week in April. On April 6, 1992, 9-year-old Evelyn Burrows went outside of the only elementary school in town with all of the other children for afternoon recess. When they were called back to their classes 45 minutes later, Evelyn was no longer with them. When questioned on where she had gone, none of the other children could recall seeing her after being released from the cafeteria. This wasn't unusual, considering the girl's lack of friends and her refusal to participate in games with the other children. What was unusual was the lack of any evidence to her disappearance. A police inspection of the fencing surrounding the school showed no evidence of tampering or disrepair that would allow her to leave the grounds unnoticed. While technically possible that she climbed the fencing, it would be considered unlikely with 4 adults watching the grounds for just such a thing to happen. Her parents were interviewed by the local newspaper after the initial investigation turned up no results and a larger, countrywide manhunt began. It was about what you would expect, a plea for help from loving parents for their daughter to be returned to them. The reporter who interviewed them found the act a little too convincing, considering the information he had already gotten from Evelyn's school about her behavioral problems and difficulties communicating her wants and needs. After Evelyn's school records, including notes from the school counselor concerning his belief that her behavior stemmed from possible abuse at home, were leaked to the reporter anonymously, the investigation began to focus on her parents. Tim Burrows was an alderman and supposed pillar of the community, so the police had to tread lightly in the beginning of the investigation. Thankfully, they didn't have to tread long, as once Mrs. Burrows was removed for questioning into a separate room, she began to tell the true story of Evelyn's home life. A life that included being locked alone in her room from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. 7 days a week because Mr. Burrows would not tolerate distractions, and playing games of "Is Mommy too drunk to take me to school" in between. Mr. Burrows was arrested and charged with child abuse. While the reporter noted in his story that the police did consider him a person of interest in his daughter's disappearance, there was no evidence to suggest he was involved in any capacity, as he was at a meeting in City Hall on the day and time in question. He was eventually convicted on 2 counts and spent 10 years at a state penitentiary. No evidence was found in the pursuing statewide manhunt for Evelyn Burrows for the next 10 months. On the January 9th, 1993, my grandmother was in her front yard next to the 10-acre wooded property. On January 9th, 1993, my grandmother was in her front yard next to the 10-acre wooded property. Before the cancer took her a couple of years ago, she made an almost daily ritual of going out and feeding the various squirrels and other wildlife that called the woods next door to their home. On this particular day, she never got the chance to, as before she could refuel the bird feeders that decorated her yard. She found a child's shoe sitting just where the grass of her yard met the woods. She told me later that it was the color that caught her eye. Being the tomboy that I was at that age, I refused to wear any color I considered girly, and the shoe on the border of her lawn was a bright pink, brought to raggedness by slight wear and small splatters of mud. What made her call the police when she found it, much to the waiting squirrel's disappointment, was the name written on the tag under the tongue of the shoe: Evelyn Burrows. For the next 2 weeks, interest in the missing child's case was renewed, and the woods combed thoroughly for any other signs of her. Nothing was ever found. On April 8, 2005, 10-year-old Philip Borg was in his backyard with his older brother Sam. They had just finished setting up a viewing box to catch the tail end of a solar eclipse when Sam looked into it to check and make sure that it was working okay. When he took his face away to Philip to go ahead and look in the box, he was no longer behind him. Another minute of calling out his name convinced him that he was no longer outside. Another minute in the house convinced him that he wasn't inside of the house either. Mrs. Borg arrived home at approximately 7 p.m. from her shift at a local convenience store to find Sam frantic. The police were called half an hour later when Mrs. Borg wasn't able to locate Philip inside or outside of the house. Just as with Evelyn Burrows 13 years earlier, there was never any evidence found to convince the police that he had been abducted. The only shoe prints found in the wet ground belonging to Philip and Sam. By seeming coincidence, the same reporter who had received the anonymous school file of Evelyn Burrows received an anonymous voicemail from an unknown number with accusations leveled against Sam Borg. The voicemail described the ways in which Sam would capture and torture small animals, going into long detail about the various tools he would use and the places he would do it in. The reporter in question didn't take this voicemail seriously until the end of the message when it mentioned a section of the school counselor's report for Evelyn Burrows that was never released to the public. When the reporter checked on one of the locations mentioned in the voicemail, an abandoned house 20 miles away from the woods near my grandmother's house, he found a small collection of vivisected squirrels and rabbits nailed to the various walls of the abandoned house. When questioned by police concerning the poor wildlife that he decided looked better as house decor, the high school senior broke down. He rambled on and on about how nothing was his fault and that it was the only way he could stop thinking about his parents and what they'd done to him. When asked to elaborate further, he described how his uncle, John, would come and visit him when he was Philip's age and make him take pictures with him. These pictures, he described, were found after a search warrant was obtained for the Borg household. Some of the photos showed a younger Sam Borg performing sex acts on an individual, later identified as John Freeman, a longtime friend of both Mr. and Mrs. Borg. Other pictures included children between the ages of 7 and 12 years old, including the recently missing Philip. Mr. and Mrs. Borg were arrested and turned state's evidence against Mr. Freeman in a concurrent FBI investigation. The court files that I looked at concerning that investigation described their testimony as invaluable in the case against the child pornography ring that stretched 3 states and over 27 convictions. None of those convictions were for the kidnapping of Philip Borg, and no evidence was found that Mr. and Mrs. Borg were involved in their son's disappearance. 10 months later, on January 7th, 2006, my grandmother was in her backyard topping up the bird feeders when her new puppy crawled under the fence and ran into the woods. The young golden retriever had done this a couple of times before and only made my grandmother annoyed instead of fearful for its safety. A 2-minute walk in the woods was usually all it took for her to find the rambunctious little thing. When she did find that puppy, Charlie, it was barking at a Red Sox cap lying in the dirt of the 10-mile woods. The inside tag had the word Pip written on it. My grandmother had been following the story of the missing children and constantly complaining about how no one seemed to care about the fact that he was missing in light of what happened to his parents directly afterwards. Because of this, she knew that Philip had a nickname that the other kids called him at school, Pip. Just as with Evelyn Burrows' shoe 13 years previously, there was never any more evidence found of the child in the 10-mile woods. On April 4th, 2010, 10-year-old Tony Ramirez was at a sleepover for a friend. This was a rare occurrence as Tony was a very sickly child who wasn't able to leave his house for extended periods of time due to a rare medical condition. He had been having a rare week of good health and his mother allowed him to join the event. The group of friends were up past the time all of them should have been asleep, playing a game that I'm honestly surprised still exists. They were taking turns going into the bathroom, turning off the light, and saying Bloody Mary 3 times into the darkened mirror. Interviews of the children later said that he had volunteered to go first in a show of bravery that would have surprised his mother. They all described the set of actions that happened as being the same. The door closed behind Tony and the lights turned off. All of them heard Tony's voice through the bathroom door chant Bloody Mary 3 times into the mirror and laughing nervously while doing it. All of the children laughed as well when they heard the fearful tone of his voice that belied his earlier bravery. A couple of them say they may have heard another voice in the bathroom, but most of them describe hearing nothing as the child closest to the door opened it only to find an empty bathroom. It took an hour for the birthday boy to get up the courage to wake his parents and describe the situation to them. After the parents realized the full grasp of the situation, they contacted police at approximately 1:37 a.m. with a dispatched car arriving at 1:52 a.m. Mrs. Ramirez was contacted at 2:07 a.m. when her son wasn't located inside of the house. The next 2 days, the whole town was littered with missing signs for the child, put up on every street lamp and storefront by a frantic Mrs. Ramirez. The story about the child led with the plea by her for his immediate return, as he wouldn't last long without taking a daily dose of his medicine. The package did not go to the reporter who had written about the previous 2 cases. It went to the reporter who had taken his spot as the lead investigative reporter for the paper. The previous reporter having died of a heart attack 2 years earlier. The package contained a pill bottle of Singulair, the boy's asthma medication, with the missing child's name written on it. Also in the package was a piece of paper that said, "Test me." This reporter had gotten up in the paper under the wing of the previous reporter and had been told of the previous package and voicemail oddities that had broken the 2 biggest stories of his career. The reporter knew the importance of the labelless package immediately and gave the cops the pills to test. Turns out the pills weren't Singulair. It was a drug commonly given to children in order to treat leukemia. The only person capable of having those pills was Mrs. Ramirez, as she worked at the State Children's Hospital. A psychiatric analysis done for her trial described her condition as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition characterized by a caregiver faking an illness for a child under their care in order to gain sympathy or attention. It's not uncommon for the child to die during this. Just like Evelyn and Philip, there was never any connection found between the disappearance of Tony Ramirez and the ensuing case against his mother for child abuse. It's January 6, 2019 as I write this. I've gotten into the habit of loading the bird feeders every morning like my grandmother did before the cancer finally took her. Charlie is still here though, and one of these mornings I'm going to go outside and he'll find something on the edge of these woods. Maybe a stuffed bear, maybe a shirt. What it is doesn't really matter as I already know who it's going to belong to.